Alright, we're going to continue talking about natural selection, and we're going to move on to discuss types of selection. So let's start out with our first type. We're going to imagine a population that starts out, the original population here is represented by the blue, starts out at one place, kind of have our standard bell curve here, and moves to another place. And so in our example, this is kind of a famous example in evolutionary biology. We have these moths that are kind of this light grayish color, and they became, over time, over generations, a darker color after selection. And the selection here happened because the Industrial Revolution took place, and factories started producing a lot of soot, a lot of ash, releasing those things out into the atmosphere. Trees that had previously been relatively light colored got stained with this ash and soot and became darker colored. Lighter colored moths, they actually stood out so much that they were more easily eaten by birds and other predators. And so the darker colored moths were very strongly selected for. And so the population moved in a direction. We're going to call this directional selection. It evolved toward darker color. Now this happened in the UK, and I will just mention that in recent decades, they've really cleaned up their environmental regulations. The air has gotten much cleaner, and the direction has moved back the other way. All right, so the average has shifted over into a new direction. Let's look at another example. In this example, we start out the original population represented by the blue there, and it becomes more narrow. So we've sort of, instead of selected for one direction, we've selected for the middle. We're going to call this one stabilizing selection. And our example here might be the number of eggs a bird lays in a nest. And so we start out, our population has quite a bit of variation, an average of, let's say, 5 eggs, but quite a bit of variation. And then the selection is against that variation. It's for that average number of eggs. And so in our example, it might be that if a bird only lays 2 eggs in its nest, well, it's not contributing as much to the next generation as if it lays 5. And so selection is for more contribution to the next generation. And if it lays 6 or 7 or 8 eggs, maybe it has such a tough time taking care of those offspring that even though it has more eggs, not as many offspring make to the next generation. So it stabilizes, selects for the middle. Our third possibility then is when we select against the middle. So select for the extremes. We're going to call this one diversifying selection. This is also sometimes referred to as disruptive selection. I guess disruptive because you're kind of disrupting or going right in the middle there and changing what's happening right in the middle, disrupting the population. So diversifying selection, disruptive selection, selecting against the middle, and for the extremes. And you might notice that one of the outcomes of diversifying selection is that the average is becoming less and less and less common. If it's strongly selected against, eventually the average may no longer even exist, and you might actually have speciation take place because you cause your population to diversify. It's a split. And maybe if it's so extreme, you now have 2 separate species. Now, I'll just point out something that's kind of interesting. In our 2 examples here of stabilizing selection and diversifying selection, the average hasn't changed, right? After the selection, the average is still the same at where you started. In stabilizing selection, the average has become much more common. And in diversifying selection, the average has become less common. And in fact, you could imagine a situation where the average isn't even found in the population anymore. It's only the extremes. Directional selection, though, has changed the average, right? It has pushed the average one way or the other. Let's keep talking about selection. We are going to move here to sexual selection. And so we're going to be talking about when choice of partners with whom to mate causes a change in selection, change in adaptation. We're going to start with intrasexual selection. Intra means within, so within one sex. So the intrasexual selection is where members of one sex determine which individuals get to mate. Now, the classic example of this is going to be when males of a species fight over access to females of the species. I actually had the opportunity to work with a species that has a really good example of intrasexual selection. I was able to study elephant seals on some islands off the coast of California, the Farallon Islands. And one of the things that we would see regularly is the males fighting with each other to try to gain access to those groups of females. In the picture here, this is kind of a crazy picture. This is the year after I was there. Some of the researchers who were there the year after I was there saw these two male elephant seals fighting with each other. And the two males were in a pretty serious battle. And then they got to be dark, so the researchers went inside, went to sleep. When they came back out the next morning, they found this bull elephant seal was dead. Apparently got caught between these two rocks, and the other seal bit him in the head and killed him. That elephant seal probably weighs around 3,000 or 4,000 pounds. And so the idea that another elephant seal was so strong it was able to actually bite through its head and kill him in this fight over access to the females is pretty impressive. I also have a short video here. This is actually the other species. This is the southern elephant seal, another species of the two species of elephant seals, showing these territorial battles, these fights over access to the females.
For a bull elephant seal, bigger is better. The males can grow up to 20 feet long and weigh over 8,000 pounds. But it's that long trunk-like snout that really amps up the sex appeal. The bulls use those massive noses to broadcast one message. This is my turf, and to mate here, you have to get through me. Elephant seals are the sumo wrestlers of the marine world. In a battle, bulk is everything, and champs win it all. Gathering harems of 40 to 50 females. Only 1 in 10 males will become an alpha male and father pups. If this bachelor wants a sex life, combat is his only answer. So the time has come to start a fight. The battle grows more intense, and the battered contenders take their fight to the water. The challenger gets a good thrashing, and the big alpha returns to his ladies for his prize. Multiple matings.
All right, so we see in that example there, it's the males that are competing with each other over access to females. We're going to say that, call that intrasexual selection, selection within that sex. There's also intersexual selection. And the kind of classic example of intersexual selection is when females of a species choose which males to mate with. Right? So between the sexes, so the females choosing which male. We often see that this results in some really ridiculous characteristics. And so the picture there is of a male sage grouse. And he's, it doesn't really look like a bird anymore. I mean, the tail feathers are pretty impressive, but then if you look up at the face, and he's got these are actually air sacs that are part of the respiratory tract on this bird that can be inflated and can be seen externally. Benefit being that the males who look the most ridiculous, the most showiest, the most impressive, tend to be the males that attract a female. And so the selection has been for this really unusual appearance that the females really like. I got another video here with an even more ridiculous bird.
The superb bird of paradise calls to attract a female. And he has more luck. But what does he have to do to really impress her? She retires to consider her verdict. It's hard not to feel deflated when even your best isn't good enough.
I mean, did you see this thing? It doesn't even look like a bird anymore. Like, what is it? It's like a blue smiley face, ridiculous black velvet. I don't even know. So, here's my point. The females choose the males, and so whatever the females like is what gets selected for, and we end up with birds that look like that. Whatever that is. Whatever that is. Okay, so this leads me to a question. Why? Is there some benefit to the females choosing males that are just completely and utterly ridiculous? I mean, the picture here is this bird. This is this blaze orange. This is a male of the species. He's blaze orange. That seems like the best way to get seen by a predator and eaten. Right? To stand out more than any other color that you could imagine, right? That's the color that hunters wear when they want to make sure they get seen by other hunters. This bird is blaze orange to impress the females of the species. Is there some benefit to it, or is it just the whims of the females? That whatever the females choose is what the males end up looking like, and there's no real point to it. Well, the answer seems to be that it is beneficial. That sexual selection is not just the randomness of the females' choices, but in fact, what females choose tells them something about the males. That the traits that the females like the best are often going to correlate, and we're going to vary in concert with health and vitality of the male. That we could say that those sorts of characteristics are honest signals of quality, right? Are telling something to the female. That when a female sees a male that has all those impressive characteristics, she says, ah, that tells me he must be a good male. For example, I was birding a few years ago up in the mountains of Venezuela. A friend and I were looking for a specific bird. One of the ones we really wanted to see was a bird called a white-tipped quetzal. This really spectacular bird that's really bright green and red, and like it's all iridescent, and really a neat bird. So we're up there birding, and we see this bird. We're trying to figure out what it is. We're looking through the bird book, and we're looking at it, and it really looks like if you take a bird and run it through a lawnmower, because it's so just beat up and just terrible looking. And we looked at the bird book, and we decided that must be a white-tipped quetzal. It's the only species that really matches. Well, when a female sees that one, she's probably not going to say, hey, I want that to be the father of my offspring. She's going to say, this male can't even take care of himself. He must not be very healthy. He must not be very strong. He must not be a good option to father the offspring that I'm going to have and to help take care of them. And so she's learned by his appearance that that might not be the male to choose. Similar sort of situation, if he's a really nice male with perfect plumage, she says, wow, he's able to get enough food to keep his plumage nice. He's able to have a good immune system to keep parasites away. That he seems to be pretty high quality. I'm going to choose him. Related to this is something called the handicap hypothesis. And the handicap hypothesis basically says, if a bird can put up with being bright orange, if it's able to attract every predator within 100 miles and still survive and still get food and still keep away parasites, even though it has that handicap of this ridiculous secondary sexual characteristic like a bright color or like the long tail of a peacock, right? Imagine it had that long tail of a peacock. How terrible that must be to try to do anything. If they're able to put up with that and still get enough food and survive being eaten by predators and everything else, well, that must mean they're pretty high quality and would be appropriate to be the parent of the offspring. All right, so now I'm going to ask the next question, which is, if natural selection and sexual selection are selecting for the most successful at surviving and reproducing, why is it we don't end up with every single individual in a population being identical? Why don't we have selection that results in identical carbon copies of the individuals that do the best? Why do we still have variation in a population, even though we know that that one genotype, for example, may be the one that the females prefer, or the one that survives the best? Why do we still have variation? And I'm going to answer this with a few different ways that can keep variation in a population. Number one, many organisms, like us as humans and most animals, are diploid. Diploid meaning they inherited one set of chromosomes from the mother, one set of chromosomes from the father. Now, when that happens, it's possible that a diploid individual has two different alleles at a locus. And it's possible that those two different alleles may not both be expressed. That one allele may be dominant. That is, it gets expressed no matter what else is present. And the other allele may be recessive. So you could have a recessive allele that maybe isn't very helpful, right? That is selected against, that is really detrimental, that natural selection would take out of the population. But if the recessive allele is present when there's a dominant allele also present, the dominant allele is expressed, the recessive allele is still there, but is invisible to natural selection. And so in that way, we can keep both those alleles in the population, even though one of them may not be that great. All right, another way to keep genetic variation in population is something called balancing selection. And the basic idea of the balancing selection is that more than one form is maintained in the population. Now, the selection doesn't just focus on one form, but can keep more than one. For example, something called heterozygote advantage. Heterozygote advantage says that when you have an individual with two different alleles at a specific locus, that maybe those individuals with two different alleles, the heterozygote, maybe they survive better than a homozygous individual. The classic example of this is something called sickle cell disease. In sickle cell disease, red blood cells end up misshapen. And when they're misshapen, that's bad because, right, it's red blood cells' job to carry oxygen. But it also turns out that in sickle cell disease, those sickle-shaped red blood cells are more resistant to malaria. And so individuals that have one sickle cell allele and one non-sickle cell allele actually survive better than either of their homozygotes in areas where malaria is present. And so what we see is that in areas with malaria, under that specific context, the selection is going to be for individuals that have one of each of those two alleles, the heterozygote, are going to survive better. And we're going to expect to see those two alleles remain in the population. Another example, and this is one of my favorite examples in this entire semester, this is really, I find really interesting, kind of crazy. It has kind of a long name, but it's not that bad. It's called negative frequency dependent selection. And basically, if we just look at it, frequency dependent, right? Frequency is just how common something is. And negative then is against, right? Is selecting against something. So negative frequency dependent selection means that whatever's the most common gets selected against. And here's the example we're going to use. All right, this is a picture of two different individuals of the same species of fish, live in the same area, and this type of fish makes its living as a scale eater. In other words, they go up to other fish and they bite off chunks of scales off the side of the other fish, and that's what they eat. Yes, sounds terrible. Yes, I'm glad I'm not a scale-eating fish, but that's how these fish make a living. Now, as you might imagine, as you're swimming up to a fish, if you're the scale-eating fish, it might be a little easier to bite chunks of scales off the side of the fish if your mouth is turned a little bit, one way or the other. In our picture here, on the bottom we have a left-mouthed scale-eating fish. Have this mouth that curves a little to the left, which means it makes it easier for that fish to bite scales off the right side of the fish that it's trying to prey on. The top picture then is a right-mouthed scale-eating fish. So it has an easier time biting scales off the left side of the fish that it's trying to prey upon. Okay, so what we're going to imagine here is thinking about how these two different types of the same species, how their numbers fluctuate in a population. And to do this, I'm going to make just a simple graph here. And I'm going to put right in the middle of the graph a line that's 50%. And so let's imagine for our purposes that we take a look at this species and we count up all the individuals that are right mouth versus left mouth. And we find that in the current population, more than half of the individuals are right-mouthed fish, and less than half of individuals are left-mouthed fish. All right, so that means that more than half have their mouths turned to the right a little, which means they're going to be eating scales off of the left side of their prey. Well, as you can imagine, the prey is not all that excited about having scales bitten off the side of them. And so they're going to kind of try to keep an eye out for any sort of scale-eating fish that might be trying to attack them. And now in the current situation where over half of the population is right-mouthed fish, it would make sense then for the prey to keep an eye out on their left side, because they know that's the side that the attack is most likely to come from. And so the prey fish are swimming around and they are guarding their left side, which makes it harder for the right-mouthed fish to eat scales off of the prey. The left-mouthed fish, though, makes it easier for them, right? Because the prey fish are guarding the other side. They're not paying much attention to the side that the left-mouthed fish are going to be eating off of, and so the left-mouthed individuals start to do better, get more meals, eat more scales. What happens? Well, the proportion of right-mouthed individuals decreases, and the proportion of left-mouthed individuals increases. Oh, but now things have changed. The left-mouthed individuals have become more common, have become the most common of the two, and the right-mouthed have become the least common of the two. The selection pressures switch. Now the left-mouthed fish are selected against, the right-mouthed fish are selected for. What happens? Things switch again. Our expectation in negative frequency dependent selection is that we continue to have this kind of seesaw, where one goes up, the other goes down, and that should continue, assuming things don't change, should continue indefinitely. That both phenotypes are going to remain in the population. The selection pressure is going to be based on which one's most common at the moment, never is going to eliminate one, because as soon as one becomes less common, it gets selected for. And as soon as one becomes more common, it gets selected against. Maintaining variation in the population, keeping both forms forever, indefinitely. All right, something else that we see that can keep variation in a population is something called neutral variation. And neutral variation is the fact that if you take a look at your chromosomes, you're going to find that there's quite a bit of DNA there that's not really doing much. It's present, it's part of the genotype, but it's not being expressed. However, even though it's not being expressed, it can still evolve due to things like genetic drift, right? Due to things like mutations. It's changing. All right, now you might say, yeah, but who cares? Right? So let's say that a mutation happens here on this chromosome in an area that's not being expressed. So what? Right? It's not being expressed. It doesn't matter. It's not impacting the phenotype. It doesn't have any consequences for the organism if it's not being expressed. That's true. But just because something isn't currently being expressed, something is currently neutral, doesn't mean something won't happen in the future that it does become expressed. So, for example, if there was a mutation here that is in neutral DNA, and then later there's another mutation somewhere close to it, maybe in the promoter region of a gene. The promoter is one of those things that helps turn genes on and off. Well, now this thing that wasn't being expressed, maybe now all of a sudden it is becoming expressed. And now you've got all this extra variation because mutations had happened. And so you have the possibility for a greater variety in that DNA. All right, so the last point I want to make then is that natural selection is not something that leads to perfect organisms. Right? Natural selection selects for whatever survives and reproduces best, but does not create perfection. Let me give you an example. Consider the frog that's about to be eaten by that bat right there. Well, that frog desperately needs a helmet. If it had a helmet, it might survive this attack by that bat. But natural selection can only select for things that are already there. The helmet's not going to randomly appear just because that frog really needs a helmet. Right? Natural selection can only select for things that are possible, things that are part of the variation in the population. They don't arise due to, I wish I had that because I'm going to die if I don't. Now, if there is some variability, if some frogs in the population have helmets and some don't, well, yeah, the ones with helmets maybe survive and reproduce better. But it doesn't just magically appear because that frog's going to get eaten. All right, let me give you another example of a reason that natural selection doesn't create perfect organisms, and that is because of peaks of fitness. So here's what I mean by this. So imagine that we're thinking about a characteristic, and I'm going to use body size as my example here. Characteristic like body size. And we have an organism that at really small body size is able to hide really well. Right? It's able to find lots of little cracks and crevices to get into, and when it's small, it's able to find lots of those hiding places. Now, let's also imagine that if it has really big, right, at the large end of its average body size, that it's able to fight back against predators, and that it gets big enough that predators really can't consume it. We have this issue then that at intermediate size, the prey item is too big to hide, but too small to fight. And so we can have these peaks of fitness, that the maximum fitness is at really small size and really big size. And maybe the maximum fitness is at the largest body size, that if they're really big, they never get eaten. If they're really small, they only rarely get eaten. And if they're intermediate, that's the time when they really get eaten. Well, you could imagine there's this issue here that it'd be very difficult then for natural selection to push that species. Let's imagine that the population happened to be over towards the small body size range. That yes, large body size would be more beneficial, but in order to get there, you'd have to go between these two peaks of fitness into this fitness valley, right? That the natural selection would incrementally push that population. If it wanted to push it over towards the largest body size, it would kind of get stuck in that small body size. But the selection pressure would be pushing it towards the local peak of fitness, you might say, the one that's closest. And so even though there might be lots of selection pressure over multiple generations, it probably will never get to that large body size because it's kind of stuck on that local peak. All right, another reason we don't have perfect organisms is because historically, organisms have experienced selection and evolution in the past that is something that the organism has to still deal with today. So, for example, if we think about that bat in the picture, historically, bats have gone through this evolutionary process of turning their front limbs into wings. Well, that means if that bat wants to do something else with its front limbs, it's kind of stuck a little bit because it has these very specialized front limbs now that do this one thing. And it'd be very difficult to use those front limbs for anything else. All right, that's a historical constraint, a constraint of of evolutionary decisions that were made in the past. Something else to think about is that organisms aren't able to do everything perfectly, right? There's always going to be some sort of compromise involved. If we think, for example, about sexual selection, right? There's some compromise that if the traits a female chooses are so detrimental, right? When a female chooses the most brightly colored male, well, they're choosing a male that is then making it more likely for that male to not survive, right? So there's going to have to be this compromise between natural selection and sexual selection. They can't both be at the maximum. The maximum for natural selection for a male might be to really be really well camouflaged, while the maximum of sexual selection for a male might be to be really brightly colored. There just has to be a compromise between those two. Alright, our final reason that natural selection does not result in perfect organisms is something called linkage. So if you've taken BIO201, you might be familiar with this. Linkage is the idea that when you have two alleles that are close together on the same chromosome, there's a better chance that they're going to get inherited together. So what that means is that you might have an allele that's relatively detrimental. It's not great. It's pretty damaging for that population. But it might be found close together on the same chromosome with an allele that is really good. So here's my really ridiculous example. Imagine we have an allele for being stupid right next to an allele for being rich. Things don't really work like this, but imagine. Well, we might see that the stupid allele becomes more and more common in the population, and we might think to ourselves, well, that's weird. Why would the stupid allele become more common? I saw a guy recently put a fork in an electrical outlet. Shouldn't that be selected against? And the answer is, well, maybe it's not that being stupid is being selected for, but maybe being rich is being selected for. Having a lot of money so that you can pay for really good health care, buy healthy food, etc. And so the selection pressure here is selecting for being rich, but the being stupid allele is getting kind of drug along with it. They're genetically linked together, so they're more likely to be inherited together. And so selection for one is influencing the other one. Right? We have to consider both the environmental and the genetic context. And we might find that an organism isn't perfect because it's got some detrimental alleles that have gotten linked with beneficial alleles.